I'm Austin, 34, and the oldest of three siblings. Growing up, I never thought my life would end up as complicated as it is now. My parents struggled with addiction, which meant that, for the most part, they weren't around. At 18, just as I was starting to plan for college, my role as an older sibling shifted dramatically. My younger siblings, Taylor and Casey, were just 8 and 10, and with our parents barely managing to stay afloat, I felt it was up to me to keep things together. So I did what I thought I had to do. I stepped in to take care of them. College went out the window. Career goals? Those too. Instead, I was juggling 2 jobs, trying to keep my siblings fed, clothed, and in school. Most of my friends drifted away over time. They were busy with campus life, internships, dating, and I couldn't keep up. I spent every penny I earned on rent, groceries, and bills. And while I was managing all this, Taylor and Casey got to be kids, maybe not in the traditional sense, but at least they didn't have to worry about where the next meal was coming from, or if there'd be enough for new school clothes. For a long time, it felt like I was doing the right thing, even if it meant I didn't really have a life outside of work and taking care of them. It's only now, all these years later, that I'm finally getting to experience some of the freedom I gave up. I'm living on my own, building a career, and even starting to date. My siblings are adults now, too, with Taylor in their mid-20s and Casey in their early 20s, and they seem to be doing fine on the surface: jobs, apartments, friends. I thought we'd reached a point where things would be easier between us. I'd finally done my part, they were stable, and I could breathe a little easier. But it didn't take long before tension started creeping in. Family gatherings became strange. I'd reach out to Taylor and Casey wanting to catch up or just be around them, but they were distant. It felt like every conversation was laced with tension, and their responses were short, almost cold. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just a phase. But then, during a recent family get-together, things took a turn I didn't see coming. Out of nowhere, Taylor started bringing up the past decisions I'd made about them, things I'd thought were buried in the past. They said I was controlling and that my rules made them feel like they missed out on a normal childhood. Casey jumped in, agreeing, saying I'd made them feel guilty for not being grateful enough. I was blindsided. Every time I tried to explain why I'd made certain decisions, they pushed back, like there was nothing I could say that would make them understand. To them, I'd been a dictator, making decisions they had no say in, and now, all these years later, they wanted me to answer for it. As if that wasn't enough, later that week, I noticed a cryptic post on Taylor's social media. Something about controlling family members and how some people just won't let you live your life. There was no name, but it was obvious who it was about. Soon after, extended family members were reaching out, saying I was being too harsh on my siblings and that I should try to understand where they were coming from. It felt like a punch in the gut. How could they, who knew nothing about the years I spent holding everything together, say I was being too harsh? The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. I sacrificed my own dreams, my own life to make sure Taylor and Casey had some stability. And now, they were acting as if that was something I did to them, not for them. The resentment was starting to build, and I wasn't sure how much more of it I could handle. They were out there, living their lives, but now that I was finally getting to live mine, they seemed to resent me for it. I felt stuck. I didn't know where to turn or who to talk to. My best friend was supportive, saying I'd done more than most people in my position would, but it didn't feel like enough. It seemed like everyone else saw things from my siblings' perspective, that somehow I'd robbed them of the life they deserved. With family piling on and my siblings acting as if I was some tyrant, I felt like I was losing my grip on everything I thought I knew about our family. That's when I stumbled onto Reddit. I'd heard stories of people sharing their experiences, getting advice from strangers. It seemed like a place where I might find some clarity. So here I am, sharing this here because I need to know, am I the one in the wrong? Should I have done things differently? It's not like I had a guidebook on how to raise 2 kids when I was barely out of high school myself. But I did the best I could, or at least I thought I did. Now, with all this resentment coming from every angle, I'm not so sure. I'd love to hear from others who might have been in a similar position or just anyone with an outside perspective. Right now, I just feel lost, and maybe by putting this out there, I'll get some insight that can help me figure out how to move forward. Update 1. After posting on Reddit, I figured things might blow over with my siblings. Maybe they'd realize the sacrifices I made and just move on. So I decided to reach out and reconnect. I texted Taylor, asking if they'd want to grab coffee and catch up. The response? A short, 1-word busy. No follow-up, no maybe another time, just busy. I texted Casey too, trying to make plans for lunch, but the response was pretty much the same. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe they were both just having an off week. Days passed, and their indifference only grew. Anytime I tried to start a conversation, I'd get 1-word answers, no eye contact, and even a few eye rolls. It was like suddenly I was a stranger. After a while, I got frustrated and decided it was time to address whatever was causing this distance head on. The next time we were all in the same room, I brought it up. Taylor didn't hold back. They said they felt like they'd missed out on a normal childhood because of me. That one sentence hit like a punch to the gut. Taylor went on, talking about how they didn't get to go to prom, missed out on family vacations, and didn't experience the fun things their friends did. I tried to explain why things were the way they were, reminding them how money was always tight, and I was barely keeping us all afloat. I even brought up specific moments, like the time they wanted to go on a school trip, but I had to say no, because we just couldn't afford it. But they didn't seem interested in my reasoning. They just stared at me like every word I said was an excuse. Then, to my surprise, Taylor demanded that I repay them for those missed experiences. They actually expected me to give them money now to make up for things like prom, summer camps, and all those normal teenage experiences. I was stunned, speechless for a moment. How was I supposed to respond to that? Before I could figure out what to say, Casey jumped in, saying I had always guilt-tripped them about not being grateful enough. They claimed I'd used my sacrifices as a way to control them, making them feel like they owed me their gratitude. I didn't even know what to say at this point. My intentions had never been about control. All I wanted was to keep us all afloat, but apparently they saw it differently. I tried to bridge the gap, even offering to pay for small things here and there, like their groceries or a bill now and then, but both Taylor and Casey shot those offers down, acting like my money was tainted or something. Every attempt I made to reach out was met with rejection. It felt like every gesture was twisted into something it wasn't. The breaking point came when Taylor brought up a specific incident from when they were around 12. They'd wanted to go on a trip with friends, but I had to say no. I couldn't afford to send them, and there wasn't enough for all the things they'd need for the trip. But Taylor saw that as me holding them back and making childhood feel harsh. When I tried to explain, they accused me of gaslighting, saying I'd always made it seem like they were living in worse conditions than they were. It felt like they were rewriting history, and I didn't know how to make them see things from my perspective. Some mutual friends knew what was going on and tried to help by mediating. They pointed out that Taylor and Casey's anger might be valid, suggesting they could have unresolved trauma from those years. I started feeling even more confused, wondering if maybe they were right. Did I mess up somehow by imposing too much discipline because of my own stress and lack of resources? I suggested family therapy, hoping we could all work through this with a professional. But both Taylor and Casey refused, acting like therapy was just another attempt on my part to control them. They made it clear they didn't want any fixing from me. To make things worse, another cryptic post appeared on Taylor's social media, clearly targeted at me. It read something like, "Some people just never understand the damage they cause no matter how much you tell them." It didn't take a genius to figure out it was about me. I couldn't believe they were airing this family stuff online like that. I started looking up articles on adult sibling relationships, trying to understand if there was something I was missing. The more I read, the more I realized there could be unresolved trauma they were holding onto. But no matter how many articles I read or how many opinions I sought, nothing could prepare me for the feeling of losing the family I'd worked so hard to keep together. So, I took a step back. I decided maybe the best thing to do was give everyone a little space. I stopped reaching out as much, stopped trying to fix things that clearly weren't going to be fixed overnight. I focused on taking a breather and figuring out what my next steps should be. Meanwhile, the comments from my last Reddit post kept rolling in. People were telling me I needed to stand up for myself and set boundaries. Some shared their own experiences, describing similar issues with ungrateful siblings or family members who didn't understand the sacrifices made for them. It felt validating in a way, knowing I wasn't alone in this situation. Right now, I'm at a crossroads, unsure of whether to keep pushing to mend things or just accept the distance and move on. My siblings have made it clear they see me in a way I never imagined they would, and no amount of explaining seems to change their minds. Update 2. After weeks of icy silence and the constant back and forth on social media, I knew that if I didn't address things directly, nothing would ever change. So I took a deep breath and sent a message to Taylor and Casey, asking if they'd be willing to meet up for an open, honest talk. I figured that maybe if we could sit down face to face, without the distractions of texts or vague social media posts, we'd have a real shot at resolving everything. When the day finally arrived, I felt a weird mix of hope and dread. I chose a neutral place, a small, quiet cafe, hoping it would ease some of the tension. Taylor and Casey arrived together, both looking stiff and tense. Neither of them made eye contact as they sat down, their body language screaming that they didn't want to be there. I could feel the tension thick in the air, and we hadn't even started talking yet. I decided to cut to the chase and began by saying I wanted to hear them out, fully and openly. Taylor didn't waste any time before launching into their complaints. Their voice shook as they spoke about feeling suffocated by the rules I'd set for them growing up, saying that my expectations left no room for them to just be kids. Taylor's face turned red, their hands gripping the edge of the table as they described how isolated and controlled they felt back then. I tried to explain that those rules were just things I thought would keep us all going. Things like curfews and core rotations weren't about control but about survival. But Casey cut me off, saying that I was only making excuses, trying to justify years of control. They looked at me straight-faced and dropped a bombshell. If I wanted to stay in their lives, they wanted an apology, a formal one. It felt like a punch to the gut. Apologize? For what, exactly? For giving up college? For working double shifts so they wouldn't have to worry about food on the table? I took a deep breath and told them I'd brought something along to help explain my side of things. I opened a folder I'd brought with me, filled with old pay stubs, bills, and receipts from those years. Evidence of the sacrifices I'd made just to keep us afloat. I laid the papers out in front of them, showing them the actual numbers, the costs of living, and how hard it had been to make ends meet. I thought seeing the facts in black and white would help them understand, maybe even see things from my perspective. But instead, they looked at each other and then back at me with blank expressions. Taylor shook their head, muttering that this felt like some twisted attempt to guilt-trip them all over again. Casey added that I was just trying to paint myself as a martyr, and that I should let go of the past instead of using it against them. I could feel the frustration rising. How could they not see what I went through to keep us all together? At that point, things started to heat up. I accused them of being ungrateful, of twisting everything I'd done into something negative. I told them I'd sacrificed so much for them, and all they could focus on was what they'd missed out on. My voice was shaking, and I could feel the hurt and resentment spilling out, but I couldn't stop. I'd held all of this in for so long, and now it was like a floodgate had opened. Before I could say anything more, Taylor stood up abruptly, their chair scraping against the floor. Without a word, they stormed out of the cafe, with Casey right behind. I was left sitting there, staring at the empty chairs, with all my carefully prepared explanations scattered on the table. I'd hoped this meeting would clear the air, but it only seemed to drive a deeper wedge between us. Later that evening, my aunt called. Word had already spread through the family, and she wasted no time letting me know she thought I was the problem. She said I should let go of my past grievances, that holding on to all these details only made things worse. She suggested that I was clinging too tightly to my sacrifices, almost as if I expected everyone to constantly thank me for them. The calls didn't stop with her. One by one, more relatives reached out, all siding with Taylor and Casey. They seemed to think I'd somehow wronged my siblings by bringing up my past sacrifices. I couldn't believe it. None of them were there when I was working 2 jobs, barely making rent, trying to make sure Taylor and Casey had what they needed. But now they all had opinions, and apparently I was the villain in this story. I decided it was time to take a step back and focus on my own mental health. I reached out to a therapist, not because I thought my siblings would join me in therapy, but because I realized I needed someone to talk to. I needed to make sense of all the emotions and resentment that had been building up inside me. If Taylor and Casey wouldn't consider therapy, then I'd go on my own terms. Days later, I received a final message from Taylor and Casey. They told me, point blank, that if I couldn't apologize and take responsibility for ruining their childhood, they'd have no choice but to cut me out of their lives completely. It felt surreal to read those words, almost like a bad dream. The comments on my Reddit post were pouring in again, with strangers sharing their own family struggles, encouraging me to set boundaries and take a stand. Many suggested that I couldn't keep sacrificing my own well-being for people who refused to see my side. So that's exactly what I decided to do. I won't apologize for things I had to do to keep us going. I won't pretend that those years didn't happen just because they don't fit Taylor and Casey's version of our past. If they're serious about cutting me off over this, then maybe it's time I finally accept it and start focusing on my own life. For once, I need to set boundaries for my own sake. Update 3. Just as I was adjusting to the idea of setting boundaries and focusing on my own life, an unexpected message popped up in my inbox. It was from an old family friend, someone who had seen firsthand what those years were like when I took on the responsibility of raising Taylor and Casey. This friend hadn't been in touch in ages, so I wasn't sure what to expect. They started by saying they'd recently heard about the drama brewing between me and my siblings and felt compelled to reach out. They shared memories of visiting our chaotic home back then, talking about how they'd seen me sacrificing my time, money, and energy to keep Taylor and Casey's lives stable. They even recalled specific incidents, times I had to miss work to take care of them, or how I'd skipped out on social events to make sure they had school supplies and meals. They said they couldn't understand how my siblings could turn their backs after everything I did to give them some semblance of normalcy. That message was like a small spark of relief. For the first time, someone who'd actually been there validated my side of things. I didn't feel so alone anymore, and it gave me a bit of reassurance that maybe I wasn't completely in the wrong. I thanked the friend, grateful for their words, and went on with my day, thinking that was the end of it. But then I found out something strange. Apparently, Taylor had been reading my Reddit posts. They'd made a cryptic comment on one of my updates, something about not everything needs to be broadcasted online. It wasn't directly linked to their profile, but I recognized the tone and specific words they often used. It felt invasive. Here I was, sharing my experiences anonymously, and they'd been snooping on my posts. I decided I needed to set another boundary. I messaged Taylor, asking them to respect my privacy and to stop stalking me online. It wasn't a fight, just a straightforward request. I let them know that if we were ever going to have any sort of healthy relationship, we needed to let each other have space, especially when dealing with our personal issues. Taylor never replied to that message, and as far as I know, they haven't commented since. A few days after that, Casey reached out, but this time it was for something different. They asked me for a significant amount of money, claiming it was to cover costs of missed childhood experiences. They even attached a list of things they believed they'd missed out on: proms, school trips, summer camps, extracurricular, each with a dollar amount beside it. The total was absurd, way beyond what I could or would even think of paying. I didn't respond to Casey's request. Instead, I let the message sit there, hoping they'd realize how unreasonable it was. The whole thing made me think back to those years when I worked nonstop to provide for them, taking on jobs I didn't even like just to make sure we all stayed afloat. I'd sacrificed everything, but apparently none of that mattered. Meanwhile, rumors started circulating in our extended family. Taylor and Casey were telling anyone who would listen that I'd been abusive and controlling. Some family members started reaching out, questioning my actions, wondering why things had gotten so bad. A few even took Taylor and Casey's side, echoing phrases about my strict parenting and obsessive control. It was like a twisted game of telephone, each call making the story worse than the last. Still, there was some comfort in the responses from strangers on Reddit. People who'd been through similar situations left comments, saying they understood how hard it was to take on responsibilities as a teenager. They encouraged me to keep setting boundaries and to protect myself from this toxic cycle. Reading their words made me feel less isolated, even though things were spiraling around me. In a last attempt to gain some sort of closure, I decided to reach out to my parents. They'd been mostly absent due to their struggles with addiction, but I thought that maybe, with some distance and time, they could provide a fresh perspective. But when I called, they dismissed the conversation entirely, saying it wasn't their issue to solve. They didn't want to dig up the past, and frankly, I think they felt too much guilt to engage. The phone call ended, and I knew I was on my own. The stress was starting to affect my job. Concentrating became a struggle, and my usual tasks felt overwhelming. Everything about my work, from the simplest emails to larger projects, seemed harder to manage with this cloud hanging over me. I considered taking a break or even relocating to a new city, just to get some space from the constant family drama. The idea of moving became more tempting as the days went on. The distance might help me refocus, and maybe it was time to build a life where my siblings weren't the center of every decision. But just as I was about to make up my mind, I received a message from both Taylor and Casey. They wanted to meet one last time to talk things over. I hesitated. After everything, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go through another round of accusations and guilt tripping. But some part of me thought that maybe, just maybe, this could be the turning point. When we met up, I finally felt. Update 4. When Taylor and Casey asked to meet one last time, I didn't know what to expect. I'd been through so many arguments with them, each one feeling more bitter than the last, but part of me still wanted some kind of resolution. We agreed to meet at a neutral spot, a quiet park away from the usual coffee shops and familiar spaces we'd argued in before. It felt like a last attempt to finally clear the air. They arrived together, sitting across from me on a bench. There was tension in the silence, each of us waiting for the other to start. After a few beats, I decided to speak first, getting right to the point. I told them, as calmly as I could, how much their accusations had hurt me, how their words had cut into everything I'd done to keep our family afloat, and how it seemed like they'd erased years of sacrifices with a few bitter complaints. I wasn't expecting an immediate reaction, but to my surprise, Casey looked away, almost ashamed. After a long pause, they mumbled something about how they hadn't fully understood what I went through. They acknowledged that I did help a lot, even if it didn't always feel perfect to them. It wasn't a full apology, but it was the closest I'd heard to one from them, and it felt like a small step forward. Taylor shifted uncomfortably before finally speaking up. They said they'd dropped the money demand, that it wasn't about finances as much as it was about wanting acknowledgement of what they felt they'd missed out on. Prom, vacations, carefree weekends with friends. Taylor listed all these experiences they'd missed, pointing out how their friends seemed to have normal lives while we were struggling just to get by. I could sense the frustration in their voice, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a direct attack on me. It was more of an admission of pain, something I hadn't seen in them before. In the quiet that followed, we shared a tense, awkward hug. It wasn't the warm, movie-ending embrace I might have hoped for, but it was something. There was a silent acknowledgement that none of us had come out of our situation untouched. We had all hurt, and maybe that hurt had twisted us into our current versions, still scarred, still holding on to bits of resentment, but maybe ready to let go, even just a little. We agreed it might be best to take a break from each other. We needed time to process, time to work on ourselves without the constant weight of these arguments. We didn't know how long it would last, but it was clear that the space would be good for each of us. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into therapy. I went from casual appointments to fully embracing the process, diving into layers of my own childhood trauma, and understanding just how deeply the responsibility I'd taken on had shaped me. My therapist guided me through understanding why I held on to certain feelings, why I'd felt compelled to sacrifice so much. It was painful, but for the first time I felt like I was finally healing. As I worked on myself, I also shared an update on Reddit, filling everyone in on the recent developments. The responses were a mix of encouragement, shared stories, and advice from people who had walked a similar path. There was a bittersweet comfort in knowing others understood the complexity of family obligations and boundaries. Soon, a new job opportunity opened up in another city. The timing felt perfect, like life was giving me a nudge to truly start over. I accepted it, packed up, and left. The move felt liberating, the first step in carving out a life that wasn't centered around family drama or guilt. I started dating, meeting new people, and for the first time I was building relationships without the constant pull of responsibility holding me back. Then, one evening, an unexpected message came through from Taylor. It was longer than anything they'd sent in a while, a heartfelt note where they acknowledged my sacrifices in a way they hadn't before. They told me they'd been thinking a lot about our talk in the park and how they now understood, at least in part, why I'd done what I did. They didn't ask for anything. It was just a simple thank you, raw and real. I sat with that message for a long time, rereading it and feeling a sense of reluctant forgiveness grow. I wasn't ready to jump back into close contact with them, not yet, but for the first time I felt open to the idea of reconnecting someday. Maybe we'd all grown enough to have a healthier relationship, and maybe we still needed more time. Either way, there was peace in knowing we'd taken a step forward. Life without the constant shadow of family pressure felt light, almost foreign. I was waking up each day, focused on my own goals, my own needs, and discovering a world outside of the roles I'd taken on too early. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. In a final Reddit post, I thanked everyone who'd followed along, who'd offered their support and shared their stories. Their words had kept me grounded during some of the hardest moments, and I felt grateful knowing I wasn't alone in the struggle. Now, with the weight of the past finally lifting, I was ready to step forward, feeling validated and truly ready to move on. Update 5. As I settled into my new life, my relationship with my fiancée, Sam, became the next big chapter one wanted to focus on. We'd been planning our wedding for months, but I'd also brought up a prenuptial agreement, something I believed would give both of us security if things didn't work out. Sam hadn't seemed thrilled by the idea, but he hadn't outright opposed it either. I thought we were on the same page. Then, after I laid out the details of the prenup plan, Sam became unusually quiet. Days went by with barely any conversation, the silence stretching between us like a wall. I finally suggested we take a few days apart to clear our minds, especially with the wedding approaching so quickly. Sam agreed, but I could tell he wasn't happy about it. After our brief time apart, Sam returned with a hard choice. He said, "It's either the prenup or me." He insisted that if I really trusted him, there'd be no need for this backup plan. I felt the weight of his words, but stood firm. The prenup wasn't about a lack of trust. It was about ensuring we both had a plan in place if life took a different turn. It was a measure of protection, not mistrust, and I wasn't willing to compromise on it. When I calmly explained this to Sam, he broke down. His voice cracked as he admitted that the prenup made him feel like I didn't fully trust him, that this plan was proof of some hidden fear. He kept pushing, saying that a relationship needed full trust to survive, and that a prenup was just setting up for failure. I stayed calm and explained that it wasn't about failure. It was about giving us both the peace of mind to focus on building a future together without the what-ifs hanging over our heads. Then came the shock. Sam confessed that he'd been consulting a lawyer too, wanting to make sure he'd be protected if things went south. He'd been planning his own version of a backup plan all along. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. It was a mix of irony and betrayal. Here he was, accusing me of mistrust, yet he'd been doing the same thing behind my back. The conversation turned tense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that both of us were trying to navigate a maze of insecurities, afraid to lose control. The pre-wedding stress wasn't just between us. Our families started to get involved. My parents supported my decision, saying a prenup was practical and would prevent complications later on. Sam's family, however, pressured us to compromise, saying marriage should be based on trust and that contracts could damage our relationship before it even started. It was an added layer of tension neither of us needed. Seeing how much strain this was causing, I suggested we postpone the wedding until we worked through the prenup issue. I thought some extra time would help us find a way forward without resentment or hidden frustrations. Sam reluctantly agreed, but the delay was a heavy blow. I could tell he felt hurt, maybe even embarrassed that our wedding plans were on hold. During the next few weeks, we had long, emotional talks. We revisited why the prenup was important to me and how it wasn't meant to undermine our love. Sam finally began to understand where I was coming from, though he still felt a bit wounded by the whole idea. It was a tough road, but we eventually came to a compromise. We agreed on a modified version of the prenup that included a clause allowing Sam to have more equity if we ended things after a certain number of years. It wasn't perfect, but it was a middle ground we could both live with. The day we signed the final agreement, I felt a strange mix of relief and tension. We both wanted this marriage, but the road to that signature had been more difficult than I'd ever imagined. Later, I shared an update on Reddit, explaining the outcome and expressing gratitude to everyone who had shared advice and similar experiences. The community support had been a lifeline during the hardest parts, and it felt right to share how everything had turned out. Afterward, I sat alone, reflecting on everything that had happened over the last few months. This prenup experience wasn't just about legal agreements. It had shown us both the importance of honest communication and the layers of trust that make up a relationship. I was hopeful that this compromise would give us a strong foundation to build on, one rooted in understanding and mutual respect. At the same time, there was a bittersweet realization that even the strongest relationships come with challenges that test every ounce of faith you have in one another. As we prepared to finally move forward with the wedding, I felt both empowered and a little saddened by everything we'd been through. I could only hope that this experience would ultimately strengthen our bond, giving us a solid start for the life we were about to build. For now, all I could do was trust that the path we'd chosen would lead us to a future where we could look back and see this as just one of the many challenges we'd overcome together. I'm Eric, 25M. I grew up believing my parents died when I was 10. It wasn't sudden or tragic in the way that people imagine losing parents might be. Instead, it was clouded, like some foggy story people only half told. They said it was a car crash, a freak accident on a winding road, but I never saw bodies, never went to a funeral, never had that closure people talk about. Instead, my aunt took me in, a distant woman who kept a lot to herself and wasn't exactly the warmest person I'd known. But she did her best to give me a roof, food, and the basics. Growing up with her was strange. She never talked much about my parents. Anytime I tried to ask, she would get this tight look on her face and say, "It's too painful, Eric. Just let it rest." She'd shut down every question and change the subject. I was 10. What was I going to do? As time went on, I stopped asking. But there were odd little things over the years. When I was 14, I got a voicemail from an unlisted number. It was just static, but it didn't feel random. I remember standing there clutching my phone, my heart pounding, convinced for some reason that it was a message from them, some strange sign. And there were other moments like that, strangers looking at me a little too long in public, or that weird feeling that someone was watching. Nothing solid, just a bunch of things that, when I looked back on them, gave me a weird sense of not really knowing the full story. One memory that sticks out was when I was about to start high school. My aunt had this old jewelry box, and in it was a locket my mom had given me, a simple silver thing with an engraving inside, something she'd given me right before she died. I'd had it my whole life, like a comfort item. Then one day, it just vanished. I turned my room upside down looking for it, but it was just gone. My aunt said, "It'll show up, stop worrying," but it never did. Fast forward to now, at 25, life seemed to be going okay. I had just landed a job abroad, a decent job that paid well, in a town somewhere in Europe I'd never been to. Funny thing is, even though I'd never stepped foot in that country, I felt this strange connection to it, like it was calling me. I couldn't explain it. I knew my parents had once traveled around that area, but there wasn't any clear memory. Just vague stories my aunt had reluctantly mentioned. Once I arrived and settled in, that odd feeling only got stronger. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there were certain streets, certain places that felt eerily familiar, like I'd been there before. I shrugged it off as déjà vu or nerves from being in a new place. One Saturday, I went down to the local market, a bustling, colorful place filled with locals and tourists. I was just wandering around, looking at stalls when I saw them. It was a couple, standing close together, laughing over some old book one of the vendors was selling. They looked like they were in their early 50s, and something about them just felt familiar. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stared, something inside me telling me not to brush this off. I almost walked away, but I pulled out my phone and quickly opened an old photo I kept of my parents, a candid shot of them in their late 20s, smiling on some beach. I kept glancing between the photo and this couple, and as crazy as it sounded, they looked like older versions of my parents. My dad had the same sharp jawline and quick smile, and the woman had that warm, familiar look in her eyes. My logical side told me I was being ridiculous, but some nagging part of me couldn't shake the feeling. I knew it was weird, but I couldn't resist following them. I kept a good distance, trying not to be obvious as they strolled through the market. They were in no rush, just wandering like regular people. Eventually, they ducked into a small, quiet cafe, one of those cozy spots that locals love and tourists usually overlook. They found a table by the window and sat close, laughing and talking, looking like they belonged there. I could barely keep myself from barging over. Instead, I grabbed a coffee and sat a few tables away, close enough to overhear snippets of their conversation but far enough to avoid drawing attention. At first, it was just small talk, weather, something about a local festival coming up. But then, I started catching bits of things that made me stop in my tracks. They were mentioning places from my childhood, talking about people I hadn't thought of in years. Old neighbors, friends of the family. I felt frozen, almost like I was in a dream. It was surreal, sitting there listening to these two people who looked like my parents, talking about memories from a life I thought was long gone. My mind raced, bouncing between the possibility that they were really my parents and the likelihood that I was losing my mind. The thought of confronting them made my stomach turn, but I couldn't walk away. I had to know. I took a deep breath, rehearsing in my mind what I'd say. Then slowly I stood up, walked over, and stopped right at their table. They both looked up, eyes widening, expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. The woman's face went pale, and then just barely above a whisper, she said my childhood nickname, one no one else would know. I could barely breathe. All I managed to say was, "How are you alive?" Update 1. After that moment in the cafe, things moved fast. The couple, the people I could only half believe were my parents, grabbed their things, looked around nervously, and motioned for me to follow. We left the cafe, cutting through a few side streets before reaching a quiet park. They seemed on edge, glancing back, lowering their voices, like we were hiding from someone. Once we found a secluded spot, they started to explain. My father, or the man claiming to be him, said they hadn't really died but had to leave, for safety reasons. He kept it vague, saying it was related to his work back then. No other details, no actual reason, just enough to keep me guessing. I thought about witness protection, wondering if they'd been running from something, but when I pressed for answers, they dodged the questions, mumbling about legal constraints. My mind was reeling, and I could feel frustration rising. I'd spent 15 years thinking they were dead, believing the story of an accident on a dark road, and having nothing to remember them by except for a single locket that disappeared just after I moved in with my aunt. And now here they were, right in front of me, alive, looking healthy and relaxed, while I had grown up alone, wondering and doubting. I wanted to yell, ask them why they thought they could just vanish and leave me to piece together a life without them. They could see my anger, and that seemed to rattle them more. As the tension grew, my mother's voice softened. She said that my aunt knew the truth all along. Apparently, she'd agreed to keep me and protect me by cutting off all contact with them, keeping the story locked up. The aunt who'd raised me, who always shut down my questions, who made me feel guilty for even bringing them up, she'd been in on it from the start. My mother's voice wavered as she spoke about the guilt she'd felt over the years, the regret that she couldn't watch me grow up. She claimed they'd had no choice, but it sounded like an excuse. They might have lived with guilt, but I was the one who'd been left in the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. I demanded proof, something to show they weren't just two strangers with a twisted story. They looked at each other, then started talking about things from my childhood, details only my parents would know, my favorite bedtime stories, the time I broke my arm on a swing when I was 6, the nickname my mother always called me. They knew everything. All of a sudden, the reality hit me. My knees buckled, and I had to sit down. These really were my parents. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved, betrayed, or just lost. They wanted to explain, but I couldn't hear anymore. I needed space to think, to breathe. After a long silence, we agreed to meet again, to go over everything slowly and try to answer my questions, whatever they could share, at least. But they kept repeating that they couldn't reveal everything, that there were things I didn't need to know for my own safety. That only fueled my anger more. I'd been shut out for years, and now they were trying to do it all over again. We parted ways, and as I walked back to my apartment, paranoia crept in. I felt like eyes were on me, like someone was lurking in the shadows, watching. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Back in my apartment, I tried to make sense of it all, pacing the room and going over every detail. I decided to call my aunt, the only person who might clear things up. She answered quickly, and I tried to keep calm, asking her directly about my parents. But she dodged my questions, acting surprised and saying she didn't know what I was talking about. I could hear the tremor in her voice. She was hiding something. Before I could push further, she hung up, leaving me with more questions than answers. I spent that night going through old photos and childhood mementos, hoping for some clue that might explain things. I flipped through every dusty album, every box of keepsakes. As I looked closer, small inconsistencies in my parents' story started to appear. A photo of my dad that I'd always been told was taken right before he died looked oddly recent. And a letter I found tucked in an old book, dated years after they died, didn't make any sense. It was in my mom's handwriting, talking about missing me, asking my aunt if I was okay. This letter shattered what little trust I had left in the story they'd spun. The next day, I realized I needed real advice. I called a friend of mine who worked as a lawyer and laid out the situation as best as I could without sounding insane. He listened, quietly processing it all, and told me that yes, witness protection programs were a thing, and maybe, in some twisted way, it was possible my parents were caught up in something like that. But the details I'd given him didn't add up fully, and he warned me to be cautious. My mind was a mess. On one hand, I had finally found my parents, people I'd dreamed of reuniting with for years. On the other, I was piecing together a story that felt more like a conspiracy than a reunion. I had no idea if I could trust them, if I'd ever get the real story, or if they'd disappear again just as quickly as they'd come back. I was lost, feeling torn between wanting to know everything and fearing what I might uncover. At that moment, I wasn't sure if I'd ever look at family the same way again. Update 2. After the talk with my lawyer friend, I knew I couldn't let this go. There were too many gaps in my parents' story, and the more I thought about it, the more I needed answers. I booked a flight back home that night, determined to confront my aunt. She was the only person left who could shed light on this mess. When I showed up at her doorstep unannounced, her face went pale. It had been years since I'd visited without calling first, and she seemed nervous, glancing around like she didn't want anyone to see me there. I didn't waste time with small talk. I told her I'd found my parents. The look on her face said it all. She knew. She tried to act surprised, fumbling over her words, but I pressed harder, refusing to let her dodge the truth. Finally, after a tense silence, she sighed, looking away as she admitted that she'd known all along. Apparently, my parents had contacted her right after the accident, arranging for her to take me in and keep me safe. She confessed they'd even paid her a monthly amount to ensure I had a stable life, but with one condition: she had to cut off all contact with them. They didn't want me knowing they were alive. I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. I asked why she would go along with such a plan, why she'd let me grow up believing my parents were dead. She muttered something about not wanting to deal with their baggage and that she thought they were doing it all for my safety. She wouldn't go into any more detail and refused to answer my questions, trying to end the conversation right there. Frustrated, I pushed past her, demanding to know if there was anything else she was hiding. She hesitated, then reluctantly pointed me to the attic. I went up, feeling the dust and stale air wrap around me as I dug through old boxes. After rummaging for a while, I found a worn cardboard box, taped up and labeled with my name. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, all unopened, all dated years after my parents' supposed death. I tore one open, and there it was, my mother's handwriting. The letters were filled with updates about their lives, questions about mine, and hints that they were watching from a distance. They'd even included advice on my school grades, birthday wishes, and encouragement. Each one was like a time capsule of things they'd wanted to tell me but never could. I tore through them, each letter making my heart pound as I read their words, imagining them in hiding, writing to me but never able to send it. But as I read on, more inconsistencies started popping up. Some of the letters mentioned money they were sending to my aunt, support to keep me well cared for. Yet she'd always claimed we were barely scraping by. And then there were mentions of delays and arrangements that didn't line up with the story they'd told me about staying away purely for safety. There was something more, something deeper, and my aunt knew it. I packed up the letters and left without even looking back at my aunt's house. If she was going to hide things all these years, I didn't need to hear any more lies from her. Instead, I flew back overseas, resolved to confront my parents once again. When I reached their place, they looked uneasy, clearly surprised that I was back so soon. Without giving them a chance to dodge, I laid out everything: the letters, the hidden support they'd given my aunt, the way they'd lied about never being in contact. They tried to explain, stammering through more excuses about protecting me and insisting they'd had no other choice. I could tell they were still holding back, avoiding the full truth. Then, they mentioned a threat that had been eliminated, saying that's why they thought it was safe to come back now. I pressed them to clarify, but they clammed up, refusing to explain. I demanded they tell me exactly what they were hiding, who this threat was, but they wouldn't budge. The tension in the room was thick, and I felt a surge of anger bubbling up. Unable to stand their half-truths anymore, I stormed out. I didn't get far before someone stepped in front of me, a stranger who looked at me with recognition. He introduced himself as an old family friend, someone who'd known my parents back in the day. The way he talked, he made it sound like he'd known me too, as if he'd been part of my life somehow, even though I'd never seen him before. Curious and suspicious, I let him talk. He hinted that he knew things about my parents, things they'd never told me. He didn't get into details, but he said they hadn't always been the good people they wanted me to believe. There were shadows in their past, things that went beyond anything I could imagine. He warned me to be careful, that asking too many questions could put me in danger too. Just as I was about to press him for more, he stopped, glancing around like we were being watched. He told me he'd be in touch and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before I could get anything else out of him. As I stood there, it hit me that whatever I thought I knew about my family, it was only scratching the surface. The truth I'd been chasing felt more distant than ever, and the questions kept piling up. Update 3. After meeting the stranger, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stumbled onto something bigger than anything my parents had told me. His words echoed in my head, shadows in their past and warnings to be careful. I felt compelled to find him again and get real answers. A few days later, I got a call from a blocked number, and it was him. He told me to meet him at a quiet cafe outside of town, a place where nobody knew me. I agreed, hoping this would be the moment I'd finally understand. When we met, he wasted no time getting into it. He leaned in close, speaking in a low voice, saying that my father hadn't just been a businessman. Apparently, he'd been involved in some kind of crime syndicate, the kind you only hear about in movies. The stranger wouldn't say specifics, only that my father had been a key figure in this group, and that his sudden disappearance was no accident. He claimed my parents had faked their deaths not just to protect themselves, but to escape people they'd betrayed. It took a moment to process, but it made everything start to fall into place. The hidden money my aunt received, the threat my parents kept hinting at, the letters with vague mentions of delays, it all pointed to a life on the run, hiding from people who would probably want them dead if they resurfaced. It felt surreal, like I was piecing together a dark family history that no one wanted me to know. Armed with this information, I stormed over to my parents' place, feeling a mix of anger and determination. When I confronted them, they looked rattled, their calm facade cracking as I threw the accusations in their faces. They tried to deny it, claiming that it wasn't as bad as the stranger made it sound, that my father's mistakes were just business decisions gone wrong. But as they talked, they admitted that yes, they'd been involved in shady dealings, and that leaving the syndicate was what forced them to fake their deaths. They claimed they did it to protect me, but it sounded hollow after all the lies. I told them I was done with their half-truths, that if they didn't tell me everything, I'd go public with what I knew, let people see the mess they'd left behind. That threat seemed to get to them. They exchanged nervous glances before admitting that if I exposed them, it wouldn't just be dangerous for them, it would put everyone they were connected to at risk, including me. Apparently, the syndicate still had eyes on them, waiting for any slip-up, any sign they were alive. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things outside my window, footsteps on the gravel path below, the faint hum of a car engine that seemed to linger too long. Every sound set me on edge. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. I wondered if it was paranoia, or if the syndicate really was keeping tabs on me, waiting to see if I'd lead them to my parents. The next morning, I called my lawyer friend, laying out the whole twisted story. He was shocked, of course, and warned me to tread carefully. He said there were too many red flags for this to be a simple case of my parents hiding out. He suggested that if things continued to escalate, I should consider contacting authorities. But he also cautioned that if the syndicate was as powerful as my parents claimed, going to the authorities might make things even worse. As I was weighing my options, I received an unexpected call from my aunt. She sounded strange, almost apologetic. She admitted she'd lied to me for years, that she had been paid not only to take care of me, but to ensure I never found out the truth. She insisted she did it for my safety, that she thought I'd be better off not knowing. It was the first time she'd ever shown any hint of regret, and it threw me off balance. I tried to move past my anger and asked her if there was anything else I needed to know. She was quiet, then muttered something about a set of documents she'd hidden away, things she thought I'd need eventually. Following her directions, I went to her house and found a dusty old envelope in a drawer. Inside were papers, false identities, passports, even bank accounts set up under fake names. My parents had been prepared to run at any moment. I returned to my parents one last time, confronting them with the documents and demanding the full truth. I told them I was done being strung along, that they had a choice, either tell me everything, or I'd cut them out of my life for good. They sat down, looking worn out, and finally began to spill the real story. They'd been involved in serious criminal dealings, things that went beyond what they'd hinted at before. My father had tried to leave, hoping to start fresh, but the people he'd crossed weren't interested in letting him go. Faking their deaths was their only way out, and they'd done it thinking it would keep me safe. They said they didn't expect me to understand, only that they were sorry I got dragged into this. As they talked, I saw a mixture of relief and sadness in their eyes, like a weight had finally been lifted. Even if it cost them my trust. They asked if I could ever forgive them, if I'd be willing to start over, but I couldn't answer. I left without saying a word, wondering if I'd ever find the closure I'd been looking for. For now, I'm left wondering if there's even more they aren't telling me, more secrets buried in the shadows of a life I thought I knew. Update 4. A few days after my last confrontation with my parents, an unmarked envelope appeared under my door. It wasn't mailed, just a plain, sealed envelope someone had slipped through the crack. Inside was a single typed note, short and chilling, "Stop asking questions." The words felt like a punch, and I kept looking around, as if expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. I decided it was time to involve law enforcement. I walked into the local police station, showed them the note, and explained my situation without going too deep. They listened, but told me that without solid evidence of an actual threat, they couldn't do much. They advised me to be careful and told me to come back if anything else happened. Their hands were tied. Frustrated, I went straight to my parents' place and showed them the letter. They looked genuinely shocked. My mother's face went pale, and my father kept turning the letter over, as if trying to find some clue. They swore they had no idea who could have sent it, claiming they'd cut all ties to their past. They seemed just as rattled as I was, which only made things more confusing. Then, as if on cue, the family friend showed up again. He caught me just as I was leaving my parents' place, pulling me aside and giving me the same vague warnings. He kept urging me to back off, saying it was for my own safety. I pushed him, demanded to know who he really was and why he was so invested in keeping me out of my own family's secrets. But he brushed it off, telling me to leave things buried and to stop stirring up the past. He wouldn't say any more and disappeared into the crowd like he'd done before. I went back to my parents, who seemed shaken up by everything that was happening. They said they wanted to make things right with me, to finally give me a chance to understand their choices. They suggested we go to a family cabin in the countryside, a place far from prying eyes where we could talk without interruption. They seemed almost desperate, saying it was time to set things straight. I agreed, but not without packing a few essentials, including a small hidden recorder, just in case things took another turn. On the drive up, I noticed they were unusually tense, glancing out the window at every car that passed, watching the rearview mirror like they were expecting to be followed. Their silence felt heavier than usual, like something was looming over them, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about me anymore. Whatever threat they were running from, it was very real to them. When we finally arrived at the cabin, they seemed relieved to be off the road. Inside, my mother took a deep breath and started talking. They explained how they had lived with new identities for years, believing it was the only way to escape the syndicate. They admitted they'd left me behind not out of choice but out of necessity, convinced that cutting all contact was the only way to keep me safe. My father's voice was steady, but his words were filled with regret, and for the first time they spoke without dodging. Then they shared another piece. They hadn't just been afraid of the syndicate. They had a network of watchdogs, people who monitored their moves and ensured they didn't reveal too much. The family friend, as it turned out, was one of these watchdogs. He'd once been a close friend and ally, but now his job was to keep them in line, to make sure they didn't jeopardize anyone's safety by slipping up or coming out of hiding. Hearing this was overwhelming, but they continued. My mother admitted that faking their deaths had been part of a calculated plan. They'd done it, believing it would keep both me and themselves out of harm's way. She broke down, confessing how painful it had been, how every missed birthday and letter she never sent had weighed on her. She described the arrangement with my aunt, the financial support they'd provided, and how my aunt had been complicit in keeping me in the dark. Then they revealed something that took me completely by surprise, a hidden inheritance. They had set aside a significant amount of money, intended for me if they ever truly disappeared, or if anything went wrong. They'd hidden it under layers of fake accounts and identities to keep it safe from any syndicate hands, making sure that, in their absence, I'd still have some security. The last piece of the puzzle came when they explained that the family friend, the watchdog, wasn't just any confidant. He was someone they'd once trusted with their lives, a person who had become their enforcer, ensuring they didn't make any mistakes that could lead back to the syndicate. This man, who I'd assumed was just a random part of their past, was actually a constant shadow in their lives, monitoring their every move to ensure they didn't make a single misstep. By the time they finished, I felt like I was drowning in secrets. My parents sat there, worn down, as if they'd finally let go of a burden they'd carried for years. They didn't ask for forgiveness, they just looked at me, waiting for my reaction. It was a strange moment, one where I wasn't sure if I should be grateful to have them back or resentful for the lies that had shaped my entire life. As I packed up to leave, they mentioned that the inheritance would be available whenever I was ready, as if it was supposed to make up for everything. I didn't respond, still processing all they'd said. Driving away, I could only think of one thing. These people, who were supposed to be my parents, were almost strangers to me now. And as much as I wanted to believe that this was the end of the story, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more waiting to be uncovered, buried somewhere in the past they'd tried so hard to leave behind. Update 5. As I was getting ready to leave the cabin, I noticed a black car parked down the road, half hidden behind the trees. It didn't look like it belonged there, and something about it felt off. I glanced back at my parents, and my father's face went pale when he saw it too. My mother quickly pulled me back inside, locking the door behind us. They whispered that the car could be someone from their past life, someone tracking them down. They had been cautious on the way to the cabin, but it seemed their precautions hadn't been enough. I started to demand answers, furious that I was still being kept in the dark about just how serious this all was. They confessed they had escape plans in place, backups, false identities, emergency cash stashes, if they ever needed to disappear again. My frustration boiled over. They'd prepared for the worst all these years while leaving me in the dark, clueless and vulnerable. I wanted answers, but the look in their eyes said they were still keeping secrets. In a panic, I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer friend, the one who'd been advising me through all of this. I explained the whole story, sparing no details, and asked him what I should do. He told me to get out of there, that if there were people watching, it could mean real danger. He suggested I leave the area as quickly and quietly as possible. Just as I was ending the call, the family friend, the watchdog, showed up at the cabin. He looked tense, his eyes darting to the car down the road. He told us we needed to leave immediately, saying it wasn't safe to stick around. When my parents asked him why he was here, he glanced at me, then back at them, and admitted that he wasn't just an old family friend, he'd been working with law enforcement, keeping tabs on them, as part of an ongoing investigation. My parents went silent, their faces a mix of shock and betrayal. They realized he'd been keeping secrets from them, just like they'd been hiding things from me. The family friend explained that the investigation went beyond the syndicate. It was about questionable financial dealings, involving both my parents and my supposed inheritance. He said my parents' attempts to hide money hadn't been as discreet as they thought, and now that money was tied up in things that would lead to legal trouble if discovered. Sick to my stomach, I confronted my parents, demanding the truth. My mother looked at me, her face crumpling under the weight of everything she'd hidden. She confessed that they had tried to leave that dangerous life behind, but debts and blackmail had kept pulling them back. She admitted they'd funneled money through fake accounts to keep themselves afloat, using some of it to secure the inheritance meant for me. It was only a matter of time before law enforcement caught on, and they'd been scrambling to cover their tracks ever since. The family friend turned to me, giving me an ultimatum. He told me I could either help expose my parents and cooperate with authorities, or face potential legal trouble myself for being involved, even indirectly. It was clear that staying silent could come back to haunt me, and he was giving me a way out. My father stepped forward, pleading with me not to turn on the family. He argued that everything they'd done was out of love, that they'd only ever wanted to protect me. He kept saying they had no choice, that they'd tried to escape their past but had been forced back time and again. He insisted that all they'd ever wanted was a chance at a normal life, away from the people they'd crossed. I stepped outside to clear my head, needing a moment to think. I'd spent years longing for family, for answers, and now I felt trapped by the weight of all the lies. The people I'd spent my whole life missing were strangers, people who had been running from a twisted past and dragging me down with them. I stood there, staring at the black car down the road, realizing that whatever decision I made, things would never be the same. After a few moments, I walked back inside. I looked at my parents, took a deep breath, and told them that I couldn't keep supporting a life built on deception. I couldn't be a part of the endless cycle of lies and hiding. I told them I would be cooperating with authorities, that I needed to start over, free from the shadows of their past. My father looked crushed, and my mother's eyes filled with tears. But I didn't back down. I picked up my things and walked toward the family friend, who nodded, understanding my decision without me saying another word. We walked away from the cabin, leaving my parents behind, knowing I was stepping into a life that was finally my own, no secrets, no lies, just a fresh start. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was the only one that made sense. I'd spent too long trapped in their web, and now, for the first time, I was free to live on my own terms.